Welcome to the Healthy Reasonings podcast with Dr. Andre. You are now listening to your number one source for clear, unfiltered conversations about your health and wellness. Join us every Tuesday for success stories, educational topics, and interviews with wellness experts from around the world. You can listen to this podcast on your computer, phone, or any other electronic device that streams podcasts. Or download each episode and listen to it on the go. Let's get started with today's episode.
Healthy Reasoners. Have you ever felt nervous? Have you ever felt frightened? We all know what it feels like. You can feel your palms getting sweaty. Maybe your heart is racing, you're breathing a little faster than you should. Your skin maybe feels a little clammy, or maybe you're just outright sweating. Maybe you feel a little trembly, and sometimes it makes your thoughts feel as if you're not focusing or everything is moving faster than it was before. And these sensations last for the duration of time that you feel that there's danger nearby. But once the threat has passed, once the perceived danger has passed, what tends to happen is, you relax. Your heart rate slows back down. Your breathing starts to slow. You're not sweating as much. And your thoughts become super clear, calm, collected. It depends on the nature of the threat. Some people feel afraid of flying. Some people feel afraid of public speaking. Some people feel afraid of going into a new place. Sometimes the danger is very real and legitimate. For example, I've been in a situation where there's been an earthquake, and I've seen people who run out of the building and end up in a parking lot and have no idea how they ended up there. When their system calms down, they realize, hey, I'm in the parking lot. How did I get here? And so what you would have felt during that segment of time where there was danger is something called the fight, flight, or freeze response, which is triggered by an arm of what is known as the autonomic nervous system. And the autonomic nervous system is a central part of your overall nervous system that regulates all the things in your body that are beyond your immediate control. So your heart rate, your breathing, the food moving from when you swallow it all the way out till the other end, the filling of the urinary bladder, your sweating, to some extent your emotions as well. And the autonomic nervous system has two arms. One is called the sympathetic nervous system, which is really responsible for that adrenaline rush that you feel. And it leads to that kind of fight, flight, or freeze. Don't forget about the freeze response that we described earlier. But at the other end is what is known as the parasympathetic nervous system. And that function is supposed to bring your system back into balance, to make you calm again, slow down the heart rate, slow down the breathing, reduce the sweating. And that arm is known as the rest and digest arm of the autonomic nervous system. So what we have is a system that is constantly regulating back and forth, not just when there's danger, but in response to tiny little changes in your environment. The body may go in one direction or the other. It may decide, okay, now is the time to rest and digest a little bit. Something else may happen in the next few minutes or a few hours that says, hey, it's time for some sympathetic activity. But it's a constant balancing act, almost like a seesaw. If you remember the old children's playground seesaw, you'd have it going in one direction first and then balancing out the other way. And the body does this thousands of times throughout the day. So this autonomic nervous system is beyond our control because it's constantly adjusting tiny little things. If you step into a room, for example, that's dark, you'll find that initially you're not able to see very clearly, but over time the pupils of your eyes will open up and you'll be able to let in more light and you'll be able to see a lot better. And so we are often not aware that this autonomic nervous system is functioning in the background because it's always balancing on our behalf. But here's a question now. What happens if the autonomic nervous system begins to change from being balancing to being stuck in one direction? So for example, what happens when you are in a situation where you constantly feel as if there is danger of some kind around, maybe not an earthquake, maybe a stressful job or a stressful emotional time, and the body decides that it's going to need to keep that sympathetic nervous system on all the time? You would then become sympathetic dominant, and the opposite is possible. For whatever reason, your body may feel like it's more useful to constantly be in rest and digest mode. Maybe that's the best it can do under the circumstances. And guess what? You now become parasympathetic dominant. And interestingly enough, this autonomic nervous system is influenced by several different things. And this is essentially the work of Dr. Nicolas Gonzalez. Dr. Gonzalez, you've heard me mention him before. He is the pioneer, the founder of the Gonzalez Protocol. And he was in Jamaica we'd say he wasn't a dibby, meaning he wasn't just your average doctor. This was a doctor who was at the top of his game. He was doing a postgraduate residency at Memorial Sloan Kettering. And at the time he was working with Dr. Good, who was considered one of the pioneers of modern immunology. They were working together and they were working on a little thing that we now know as bone marrow transplant research or stem cell research, which even today is still a cutting edge part of medicine. And so Dr. Gonzalez was a very bright, intelligent man. He won several awards throughout his residency, throughout his career, even in medical school. And he was extremely well regarded. During the time of his residency, though, he became aware of the work of somebody I mentioned a couple of episodes back, Dr. William Donald Kelly, who in fact had been building on the work of Dr. John Beard. And what Dr. William Donald Kelly, who was in fact a dentist, had discovered was that nutrition wasn't just about getting fuel into the body, but nutrition also facilitated an impact on the autonomic nervous system. So all of these doctors were aware that nutrition as we know it isn't just about getting vitamins and minerals in to provide energy, about building blocks for storage and for repair, but it has a direct impact on whether one is sympathetic dominant, parasympathetic dominant, or pushed back into the center, balanced as we now call it. And so Dr. William Donald Kelly, in fact, had discovered that nutrition and several other little things that I'll mention was so powerful that he had been diagnosed with a large pancreatic mass, presumed to be cancer, and he had cured himself of cancer using nutrition as well as specific supplements to influence his autonomic nervous system and change his metabolism. He had cured himself, and he had subsequently found that several people were coming to his dentist's office asking for help with their diagnoses. And he really didn't know what to do, so he ended up treating them, so to speak. He made recommendations in his capacity as a dentist. And he had developed a bit of a reputation. So Dr. Gonzalez was assigned to do somewhat of an elective with Dr. William Donald Kelly. Dr. Good gave him permission, and he spent several months there. Whilst he was there, he looked through all the case studies. He actually met with some of the patients. He looked through all the different theories and the work that Dr. William Donald Kelly was doing. There were several questionnaires that were being used to evaluate the patient to see whether they were likely to be sympathetic dominant or parasympathetic dominant, or sometimes even balanced in the middle. And based on this, they were treated in ways that would help to bring their system back into balance, straighten out their metabolism, and usually what that did is it brought the body out of a state of dis-ease and back into a state of ease. And so Dr. Gonzalez, being a scientific researcher himself, quickly realized that there was something there. This wasn't just a quick hype or a claim or an urban legend, but this was well thought out, reproducible work that had been demonstrated to be helpful in several patients, several of whom were still alive. And it wasn't just cancer. These same principles could be used to help people with chronic diseases of various kinds. And this was borne out in all the case studies that he observed. So Dr. Gonzalez and Dr. Kelly worked together for several years, and ultimately what emerged from that relationship is what is now known as the modern Gonzalez Protocol. And Dr. Gonzalez went on to have a very successful practice in New York City for several decades, and he treated numerous patients for a variety of diseases, but of course became most famous for his work with cancer. So, broadly speaking, the work that was done prior to these two gentlemen by Dr. Weston Price, he also was a dentist several years prior, probably several decades prior. He traveled the world and looked at various populations of healthy tribes and healthy indigenous people. And he discovered that there were several influences on their health. One, for people who were in cold climates, for example, Eskimos or people who lived in the mountains and the Alps, they had a tendency to be parasympathetic dominant largely. However, because of the cold climate, their bodies were often pushed back towards balance, away from being parasympathetic dominant. What essentially happened was the cold climate was a sympathetic stimulus to push them back towards balance. And interesting enough, they also in their region didn't have much in the way of vegetables, and so they were forced to have animal protein. And animal protein was also very impactful on the autonomic nervous system, ultimately resulting in it being pushed in a sympathetic direction as well. And so the reason largely why these people were so healthy was, one, they were eating clean food. We spoke about that before. But also their system, their environment and their nutrition worked together to balance their predominant their dominant arm of the autonomic nervous system. Similarly, for people who lived in sub-Saharan Africa, they tended to eat a lot more vegetarian and grain type of a diet, and they were largely sympathetic dominant for the most part. And the warm climate was able to push their bodies back towards center, away from sympathetic dominance and towards being more parasympathetic. And so they settle off in the center, both with their diet and the climate of their environment, ultimately resulting in them being nice and healthy. So this has an interesting little segue, because many of us will remember it's been an urban legend for some time now, where it has been reported that cancer responds best to an alkaline diet. So let's evaluate that statement a little bit. If cancer responds best to an alkaline diet, that means that what we're saying is that cancer responds best when the body is pushed towards being parasympathetic dominant, because an alkaline pH in the body usually has a parasympathetic effect. Similarly, an acid pH in the body usually has a sympathetic effect, which means that if you do something to your body to make it more alkaline, you're pushing it towards rest and digest. If you do something to make it more acidic, it's because you have pushed it towards being fight, flight, or freeze. So listen to this now. Animal protein largely pushes you towards fight, flight, or freeze. Vegetables tend to push you in the opposite direction towards rest and digest. And so we can say to ourselves, yeah, most of the people who we see that have cancer, we could argue that they're all sympathetic dominant, and so everybody should be pushed alkaline. But that's obviously not true, because there's going to be a subset of people who are parasympathetic dominant, and if they develop cancer and we give them something to make them more alkaline, i.e. more parasympathetic dominant, what we're then saying is we would like to push them further parasympathetic dominant, which means further away from center. And that is really not a good idea. And it is why we need to evaluate each patient on their own merit. Let's take a quick break, and we'll be right back with some more information on this.
Today's episode of the Healthy Reasonings podcast is brought to you by
Teshuva Wellness.
the team at Teshuva Wellness is committed to helping you return to your best self. With safe, non-toxic, scientifically proven medical treatments, they help your body heal from life's most difficult diseases. A team of medical professionals is ready to walk with you on your journey back to wellness. Visit their website today at teshuvawellnessja.com or call 1-876-787-8197. That's 1-876-787-8197. Teshuva Wellness. Return to your best self. Now back to today's episode.
All right, so we're back. And we are looking at, most recently, the whole story of acid versus alkaline pH. And we're now realizing that, generally speaking, most patients with cancer are likely to have behaved in a sympathetic dominant way if we metabolically type them. But it's not all. And so if you have a patient who is parasympathetic dominant, that patient really ought not to be told that they need to make their body more alkaline, because that's actually more dangerous for them. And this is why the Gonzalez Protocol is so good, because what it does is it offers an individualized dietary plan to each patient. It offers 7 subtypes by which we can type our patients, ranging from on the far extreme left, for left and right, left being sympathetic dominance. So on the far left, we'd have somebody who is extremely sympathetic dominant. A little bit inwards from that, somebody who is moderately sympathetic dominant. A little bit inwards from that is somebody who is more or less balanced, but a little bit sympathetic dominant. And inside the center is somebody who is efficient, balanced. Outside of that, on the other end now, would be somebody who is balanced for the most part, but a little bit parasympathetic dominant. On the outside of that, somebody who is moderate parasympathetic dominant. And finally, somebody who is extremely parasympathetic dominant. And the way how Dr. Gonzalez stratified these patients was he said, hey, let's stratify them based on the diet that would be best for them. So somebody who is extremely sympathetic dominant would be an extreme vegetarian. Next person would be a moderate vegetarian. A little less extreme would be a balanced vegetarian. In the dead center would be an efficient, balanced person. To the right of that, going the opposite direction, we'd have somebody who is balanced but carnivore, meaning somebody who should be eating meat. Next would be somebody who is a moderate carnivore, and finally somebody who is an extreme carnivore. What that means, therefore, is there is a subset of patients with cancer and chronic disease who should be eating large amounts of animal protein. Let that sink in for a little bit. And then ask yourself the question, how do we know who these patients are? And this is the beauty of the Gonzalez Protocol, because we use different ways of evaluating the patients before recommending their program. And so we have an individualized dietary approach. But wait, that's not all. Because if we can do an individualized dietary approach, the next approach should be an individualized supplement program. And again, Dr. Gonzalez was brilliant here because he discovered, with building on the work of his predecessors, of course, he realized that some supplements all supplements really have an impact on the metabolic or the autonomic nervous system, your metabolism. So, for example, broadly speaking, magnesium tends to be alkalinizing or parasympathetic stimulating. Magnesium tends to push the body towards a rest and digest mode. On the other hand, calcium tends to push the body towards sympathetic dominance or the fight, flight, or freeze mode. And you could go through a whole ton of supplements and realize exactly what their impact is. Dr. Gonzalez did just that over the years. And that helped to fine-tune his program so that we could know how to recommend just the right supplement for somebody to bring their system back into balance and to keep it there, while at the same time providing the nutrients, minerals, and so on that is needed for repair. Remember, we spoke in a previous episode about the 4 things that are needed for a good cancer protocol, for cancer to be treated. Treating the cancer cells is just one part of it. The next part is going to be providing adequate nutrients to facilitate repair. The next part is going to be adequate detoxification. And finally, it's going to be emotional and spiritual support. With respect to detoxification, Dr. Gonzalez again made great strides in recommending individualized detox programs, because remember what we said is that we don't want to take a patient who is already too alkaline, i.e. parasympathetic dominant, and to then tell this person to do detoxifications that's going to make them even more parasympathetic dominant or alkaline. And so Dr. Gonzalez tailored the detoxes based on the patient's metabolic type again. And so once a patient starts a Gonzalez protocol, it is assumed that every single intervention that is made, the food that they eat, the supplements they take, the detoxes that they do, is all going to be pushing them in the direction that we want them to be in metabolically. In other words, we're trying to get their autonomic nervous system back to that central and balanced location. But there's one last thing that we need to talk about when we speak about the Gonzalez protocol, and it is absolutely brilliant. We're going to take a quick break and we'll talk about that right after this information.
Healthy Reasoners. Remember to subscribe to this podcast so you can be updated as soon as new episodes are ready. Also, if you have a question, send us a voice memo on Spotify or type your questions out in the comments. Now back to today's episode.
We're back. And I know that several of our healthy reasoners have heard about the power of pancreatic enzymes. You may have heard that they're useful for generally good health, for chronic disease, specifically for cancer. And most people, when they think about the Gonzalez protocol, they immediately remember the first thing they say is, hey, what? Oh, that's the one with all the enzymes. So where did this all come from? Well, it came from the work of Dr. John Beard, who was an embryologist in the early 1900s, and he looked at a lot of embryos of various species, and he made observations under the microscope that became fundamental for evaluating how animal embryos operated, and by extension how human embryos operated. And he noticed something very interesting. First of all, he evaluated what are known as trophoblast cells. Trophoblast cells are the cells of the maternal or mother's placenta. The placenta is the afterbirth that comes out after the baby is born. And before the baby is born, the cells of the placenta are actually a part of the embryo initially. And they invade the lining of the mother's uterus to create a firm anchor between the mother and the fetus or unborn baby. And that anchor helps to keep the baby having access to the mother's nutrition via her bloodstream, as well as being able to get rid of things that it doesn't want. So the placenta, therefore, needs to be firmly anchored in the mother's womb, but not too firmly, because you don't want it to come out to the other end, do you? And so the trophoblast cells have very specific features, and I want you to listen to these features and tell me what sounds familiar. So the cells that are required to invade the mother's uterus to create that anchor, they have the following features. Listen to this. 1, they multiply very rapidly. 2, they are able to attract blood flow for themselves. 3, they are able to avoid or evade the immune system of the mother. 4, they release an hormone called beta-HCG, which we know as a pregnancy hormone, or the way that we test to see if someone is pregnant. Another one is they are able to, they have good adhesive properties. They're able to latch on or stick to the mother's cells quite easily. And of course, they're invasive. They're able to penetrate through the lining of the mother's womb. Now, let's think about those properties and tell me what sounds familiar about them. Absolutely. They sound exactly like how cancer cells operate. And so what he theorizes, wait a sec, I wonder if these cells are really behaving just like cancer cells. And if I observe them closely enough, maybe I'll find out something about them. And he did. He realized that there must be a point at which these cells get some sort of a signal to stop dividing, multiplying, and invading. Otherwise, they'd just take over the mother's entire body. And in fact, what he discovered was that at about day 56, I think, off the top of my head, of the mother's pregnancy, the cells of the placenta just suddenly stopped dividing, stopped multiplying, stopped invading, as if something had told them to stop. And coincidentally, that happens to be the same exact time that the baby's pancreas first produces pancreatic enzymes. And so he thought to himself, I wonder if this release of pancreatic enzymes from the baby, who, by the way, doesn't need to eat for quite a few more weeks, so there's no need for those enzymes for digestion of food. And yet, here is this thing happening, and at the same time, the placental cells stop. And he said, well, maybe it is the release of the enzymes from the fetal pancreas that causes the placenta to stop dividing. And he was right. And he took it further to say, well, maybe if we continue to do the same thing in adults, maybe this would help with cancer cells. And again, he was right. But like any good, like any great discovery in medicine, it took a little time for people to recognize just how right he was. Because he had quite a bit of influence at the time, he was able to get published in a few journals. And in fact, there were several people who took some of the work that he did and replicated it successfully in other cancer patients, to the point where there were reports of tumors literally disappearing after the patient was given high doses of pancreatic enzymes. However, the exact dosage, strength, and type of enzymes varied from study to study. And so after a while, people started to say, well, this thing doesn't work as consistently as we thought, so maybe it's not really true. Dr. Gonzalez was aware of all of this work, and he realized that if he was going to be able to get those benefits, he would have to get really good enzymes. And so today, what we have is very high-dose enzymes that are harvested from animals at the time of slaughter. They're carefully prepared in the lab or in the manufacturing plant, stored and preserved very carefully in a way that doesn't introduce additional problems, and then made available for human consumption at very high doses, which then in the cancer patient sends a signal to the cancer cells to stop dividing, multiplying, etc. This will be a good time to remind you that the information I'm providing here is entirely for information purposes and to increase your education. It is not intended to be advice for any specific medical condition. And if you do have a medical condition, please seek advice from your own healthcare practitioner, or if you don't have one, find a good one that you trust and ask for professional advice. Do not attempt to do anything I describe here on your own without medical supervision. So now what we have is what I consider the holy grail, so to speak, of possibilities for a comprehensive protocol that does several things. One, it provides an individualized way of designing a dietary plan for the patient. Two, it provides an individualized supplement plan so the patient doesn't have to guess and spell what they should be taking. And also, they're not taking anything that's duplicating the same impact of another supplement. And finally, individualized detoxes so that everything is geared towards supporting the patient's autonomic nervous system to get back to balance. So how does this thing actually work? Has it even worked? Let's talk about that right after this break.
Are you enjoying this episode? Remember, we are depending on you to help this podcast grow. Take a moment to leave us a 5-star review in your podcast app. Go ahead. We'll wait. All done? Okay, now share this episode with 5 friends. Thank you.
And yeah, so we could always talk about things in theory, and we could always talk about the success that Dr. Gonzalez had, but what does that success really look like? And to answer that question, we need to look at the work that was published by looking back at several of his case studies. Now, Dr. Gonzalez unfortunately passed away under very an untimely and mysterious death in 2015. And he left behind boxes and boxes of case studies that he had written up and writings of various kinds. Now remember, this was a gentleman who was so successful and renowned that he had gotten grant funding to do several large-scale trials. Quite a few, more than any of us could have expected him to under the circumstances. And he was well regarded, presenting at very prestigious conferences and across the world. And so what we actually realized, for those of us who are just being introduced to his work, is that he had been demonstrating very meticulous findings in his patients. So he wasn't just saying, oh, this is a patient that got better. He actually had MRIs, CT scans, histology reports, all the different things to document clearly that this was a real patient with real improvement. Published work posthumously is known as Conquer Cancer Volume 1, which lists 50 cases of pancreatic cancer and breast cancer successfully treated, followed by Conquer Cancer Volume 2, which showed 60 odd more cases of other types of cancer successfully treated as well. He also has several other books outlining what happened with the trials that he participated in, his views on various dietary strategies, and why he believes the Gonzalez Protocol works. And my favorite book, Nutrition and the Autonomic Nervous System, which goes through essentially what we've spoken about in this episode. What have I learned about the Gonzalez Protocol? Because I, in fact, have been certified in this protocol myself. I was certified in 2021, very rigorous training. And in fact, I also am the case reviewer for cancer cases being treated on the Gonzalez Protocol across the world. And I've seen several things that make my jaw drop, because it's easy to look at something like this and think it's too good to be true. And as somebody with the extensive training that I have had, initially it did seem that way. But of course, looking at hard evidence is difficult to just gloss over it. You have to take a closer look. And one of the things that fascinates me about this protocol is, one, the results that we're seeing with patients living, for example, pancreatic cancer is not expected to have a survival time beyond 6 months, even with the best of care. On average, you're looking at 3 to 6 months of survival. And what we have is patients who are treated with the Gonzalez Protocol or placed on the Gonzalez Protocol, who are living not a few months, but several years, sometimes as many as 30 years. That's one. So they're living way beyond what would be expected across the board, across the types of cancer. But two, a lot of these patients were diagnosed in their 50s and 60s when they wouldn't have had the vitality of a younger patient to be able to recover as well as you'd expect. And yet many of these patients have lived well into their 80s and 90s after their diagnosis, which means that not only have they survived cancer, but they've also outlived the majority of people who did not have cancer. They're living longer than would be expected for anybody at all. I've even had the privilege of meeting some of these people who are still alive years after being diagnosed, speaking with them, realizing that they're still taking the protocol to varying degrees, and they're enjoying it, and they're enjoying life. So all I can say about this protocol is that certainly for today, at the time of this episode, I am a fanboy. I've recognized that the principles we have discussed as healthy reasoners, the ability to properly evaluate each patient and treat them on their own merit, is critical for cancer treatment, and it's something that is evident with the Gonzalez Protocol. There's a clear track record of success. There's sound scientific principles, and I don't know what else to recommend. As it is now, I've had the privilege of treating several patients myself. What I do is I essentially treat them from wherever they are in the world via Zoom by helping to design the protocol based on their metabolic type. And I enjoy doing it. Why do I enjoy it? Because as soon as a patient begins a protocol, one of the first things that they will mention is that they feel better. And I think it's critical if you're going to be on a protocol that's geared towards healing. Yes, I know that the body, while it is healing, there may be times when the body is really going through a lot to heal and it may not feel too good. But generally, patients want to be able to feel better when they're doing a protocol that's helping them heal. Nobody wants to be diagnosed with a deadly disease and have to go through treatment that makes them feel even worse all the time. Or even if it's not about feeling, that helps to make their body less strong than it was. So feeling bad is not necessarily always the yardstick, but if your body is being broken down by the treatment, that can be very disheartening. And so I like this protocol. I'm going to be dropping some of the books that you can that you can download on Kindle or buy and have shipped via who, that distributor of books who they don't sponsor my episodes, so I'm not going to give them the privilege of being mentioned here. But I'm going to drop the notes that you can use to order your own copies. You can read about the work of Dr. Gonzalez. More importantly, for those of you who have made it to the end of this discussion, I wanted to give you a big surprise. But before I tell you what that surprise is, just listen to this quick bit of promotion.
The team at Teshuva Wellness is offering a free video consultation to one lucky listener on Spotify. All you have to do is leave a comment in the Spotify comments section below, and you will be entered for a chance to win. The promotion runs until August 20th, 2024. The winner will be contacted by the Teshuva Wellness team with details. Leave that comment right now. Teshuva Wellness, return to your best self.
All right. Thank you for sticking with me as we went through a very heavy, intense discussion. I've tried to make it, summarize it as best as possible, but this is really high-level stuff we've discussed on today's episode. Before we go, I'd like to first of all remind you that you can find me on social media, Wellness Doc Jamaica, WELLNESS DOC JAMAICA. You can feel free to reach out to me there. I'll try my best to respond. You can also leave comments below. If you're listening on your podcast player, just drop your comments below. Tell me what you're thinking. There's going to be a poll as well. If you're listening on Spotify, there's going to be a poll below. I'm encouraging you to fill it out. It's going to be very exciting to see what the results look like. And finally, the surprise I mentioned, we have an extra special guest coming up. This guest is somebody who you want to hear from them about the Gonzalez Protocol. Let's put it that way. I'm going to give you a little sneak peek and you can tell me if you can figure out who it is.
Hey, Healthy Reasoners. I will be the special guest in the next episode. You do not want to miss it.
All right, you heard that voice. So coming up in the next episode is going to be an interview with the person you just heard. You're not going to want to miss it. It's an extra special bonus episode. And guess what? It's going to be our very first video episode. So you're definitely not going to want to miss that either. Thank you for supporting the Healthy Reasonings podcast, your number one podcast for clear, unfiltered information about your health and wellness. I'm looking forward to seeing you again in the next episode. Keyword there being seeing. Love you guys. See you soon.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Healthy Reasonings podcast. Remember to subscribe to this podcast so you can be updated as soon as new episodes are ready. If you have a question, send us a voice memo on Spotify or type your questions out in the comments. For more information or to become a sponsor, please check the show notes for our contact information. See you soon.